Okay, it's a few minutes past 3, so I think I am going to make a start. I know our last speaker is joining us as we speak, so we can do the housekeeping while a few more people are joining. That would be really helpful, but I'm conscious I think it's going to be a very, very interesting subject, so I don't want to delay the day any further. So I just want to say good afternoon. Firstly, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all from behalf of myself and Lindsay, who are the champions for care experience people and the Insights team, to our event, which is entitled Reframing Learning for Care Experience People. So my name's Debbie Mackay, for those of you that don't know me, and I lead, the operational lead for care experience people in custody. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go on. But before we start, I just wanted to remind people of the housekeeping rules. I'm sure you're very familiar with Teams and conferences now, but just as a reminder, and to answer some of the questions I know coming in the chat, is that the event is being recorded, and the recording will be sent out to you along with copies of any of the slides that are shown. The second thing is, obviously there's a lot of us. I think we're on 152 and climbing at the moment, so I'd be really grateful if while people are speaking you could keep your microphones muted, but it is really great to see people, so if you can keep your cameras on as well, that would be amazing. And then thirdly, the chat function. I'm sure you're very familiar with that now, but if you can use the chat function as you do for any questions or any comments as we go along, there will be a question and answer session at the end, led by Lindsay, who will explain more about that in due course. So I'm delighted today to introduce the panelists. We'll be hearing a little bit from myself, as the HMPPS lead, just to put this issue into a little bit of context. You'll be hearing from Lindsay Cobden, who is my opposite number crossing probation, and we work very closely together under the spirit of One HMPPS. So Lindsay will be explaining a little bit more of the context of what we're trying to do to improve outcomes for care experience people, with a particular spotlight on probation. And then I'm delighted to welcome our very, very special guest presenters today. Charlotte Elliott, who's joining us from Affinity 2020. Thank you, Charlotte. And Stephen Hawksworth, who may or may not be here yet, but he's just been sent the link. I think he's running a little bit behind, from Wakefield Council. So it's just remains to say thank you so much for agreeing to give up your time for this really important subject. So I don't propose to do a huge long introduction, because I think it's much more important that we hear from our guest speakers. But I just wanted to put into a little bit of context about why it is so important that we understand much, much better our care experience people across the criminal justice system. So a little bit anecdotally, my background is purely operational. I've been in the prison service for more years than I care to remember, to be perfectly honest. Around 32 years. And in all of that time, I've worked quite a lot with young people. And don't forget, this is not just about younger people, it's about care experience people of all ages. But in that time, I worked in a number of young offenders institutions, and I worked quite a lot, probably 4 or 5 different prisons, which specialised in looking after young people. And I'm really ashamed to say, in all of that time and all of that experience, it was only very recently, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, when I was the Deputy Governor of Brinsford, that I started to realise that we had a lot of young men in Brinsford who had experienced the care system. And actually, those experiences meant something still to those young men. And quite often, I'm not going to say for all, obviously, but quite often, my observations were that these were quite complex young people. They struggled quite a lot to communicate. They struggled with relationships. Often they didn't have anybody that was family or anybody that they could connect with. They more often than not kept coming back. They didn't like going to education. They didn't like any sort of learning. They struggled to find somewhere to live and for somebody to look after them when they left prison. And often they felt that there was no hope and there was no future, because they were a care leaver, or because they were a prisoner, or they were a care leaver who was in prison. And there just didn't seem to be any hope for this group of people. And there was also almost a sense of worthlessness, I think. But also, what I saw was a group of people that were some of the kindest people I'd met in our prisoner population, and some of the most resilient people I'd met. And actually, when you took time to engage with them, responded brilliantly to somebody showing an interest to them, and somebody caring about them, and somebody trying to support them. Sometimes it wasn't that easy. Sometimes you had to work really hard to get them to trust you to do that. But there was definitely a real glimmer of hope when you did take that time to engage with them. So I think, I'm kind of describing that because I think at that point, it struck me that we had a group of people that we really did need to understand much better. So hence at that point, I went to see our champion for care leavers, who was Teresa Clark in the prison service at the time, and said, can I help? And then this is what I'm doing to help. So she seconded me to a full-time role, really, to improve outcomes for our care experienced people in prison. And over the 3 or 4 years that I've been doing this job, I think one of the most important things really is to start to begin to understand where this group of people are coming from. And that's not just our young people and our kids, that's people of any age. These experiences don't go away just because you hit 18 or 21 or 25 or 40. All our experiences as children are still with us as adults. It's no different for these guys and girls. So I think I just wanted to set a little bit of context. We are a little bit late to this party as HMPPS. But I think, we have done some improvements in the last few years around improving people's awareness. But this is why it's important. Probably around 25% of our adult men in prison have had care experience as children. That's a quarter of our people in our prisons. So prison people sat there, prison governors, if there's any of you guys, that's 25, that's a quarter of your people in prison have had these experiences. For our women, it looks like it's a lot higher than that, potentially around 30%. Across the criminal justice system, 49% of young men, so young men under 21, have had experience of the care system. So that's half the people that have had exposure to the criminal justice system. And when we talk about narrowing it right down to a smaller group, so our girls in prison that are aged 15 to 18, 61% of those have had care experience. So you can start to see this is a lot of our people, actually. Yeah. And if you think about why people get taken into care as children, and it's to protect them. We know it's to protect them, and quite often the majority of them have good experiences, come out the other side and thrive as adults. But some of those people, and there's lots of research into why that might be, but some of those people don't thrive quite so well, and they end up coming to us and having contact with the criminal justice system. And that this presentation today is not so much about those pathways, but it's important to realise that those pathways are very, very real, from care to the criminal justice system. And the statistics are suggesting that about 66% of children last year were taken into care because of abuse and neglect. So straight away, for the majority of those people that we've got in our prisons, they had a childhood where they were exposed to some sort of abuse or neglect. That's even before they got to the care system. Other reasons for children being taken into care include bereavement, they include family dysfunction, they include, parents being poorly, a high percentage of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Think of the experiences that those children have had as youngsters. So bad that somebody, I know one occasion where somebody's, actually strapped their children underneath the lorry and sent them across to England because that's infinitely better to what they're seeing in their own country. So straight away, what we've got is a high proportion of our people, but a proportion of our people who have experienced significant trauma as children, even before they get to the care system. Now, the care system often does a brilliant job at supporting those children, but some of the things that do come out is, people have multiple placements. They might have for all sorts of good reasons, they might have inconsistent carers or inconsistent people with them. So all of that stuff impacts on that healing from that trauma. And then they come to us. Then they get to the prison system, and with the best will in the world, we try so hard to be trauma informed, but prison is a traumatic environment. So all of this stuff contributes to us having having a group of people, and it should be little wonder that might struggle to communicate with us, that might get angry, that are hurt, that might feel that they're worthless. And, you know, these were our most vulnerable children once upon a time. So, you know, my view is surely we owe it to that group of people to understand them better. And in understanding them better, hopefully improve their outcomes. And improving those outcomes, we contribute for within HMPPS to what our aims are, you know, safer prisons and ultimately, hopefully, a reduction in reoffending. So I just really wanted to kind of put this into a bit of a context, because the reason we've invited Charlie and Steve here is that they have a different approach and a different way of helping us understand what those experiences mean to people through their childhood, through their teenagehood, but also into their adulthood. And as practitioners across, I know there's lots of HMP practitioners, but there's lots of practitioners from other organisations. Actually, it will help us understand, hopefully, what can start to work for us to understand these experiences, and you know, try to do something to redress that balance and support that group. So I'm not gonna because I could wax lyrical about this for the whole session. It's not about me. It's not about me today. It's about Charlotte and her work. But I am gonna, before we move on to that, just hand over to Lindsay, who's going to explain a little bit more about the context from an HMPPS probation point of view. So thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks very much, Debbie. I'm also very, very excited to be here today to listen and to learn. For those who don't know me, and I would imagine that is the vast majority of you, I am the National Project Manager for Care Experience within the Probation Service. And I will stress that I am a project manager. I'm not a frontline practitioner. So this is very much an opportunity to build on my own knowledge as well. So I'm sure everybody on this call will absolutely agree that emerging research is so important for developing an understanding of people who come into our care, and also helps us to better address specific needs. Like from a probation perspective, I would say the psychological research you'll hear about today could possibly really help you to understand why care experienced people may exhibit certain behaviours, thought patterns, and make certain decisions. So I'm thinking off the top of my head, like, does it potentially explain why individuals don't show up to their probation appointments on time? Is this why they're not engaging fully with their sentence plan? Could it potentially help us to like sequence interventions and offers from like our CRS providers? Would they benefit from the range of approved toolkits that we have on offer to help us to better understand the individual and also develop those key pro-social behaviours? But to situate this into the bigger picture, so to speak, research like this really helps us to action and shape our HMPPS strategy for care experienced people, which you can find on the HMPPS intranet. And our external attendees can also find this online. Just give it a quick Google. So this strategy was introduced, I think it was in 2019, and it has a very clear vision, which this research really complements and enhances very well. So I'll quote that to you now. We will seek to create a culture where those who have experienced being in care as children feel confident to tell us in the knowledge that we will provide support and empathy. Working in partnership with local authorities, the voluntary sector and other government departments, we will help them access their legal entitlements and support them on their journey away from offending. Recognising that some people who have experienced care have suffered adverse childhood experiences and trauma, we will seek to value, support and enable them to look forward with hope to achieve their full potential. So, I mean, since the introduction of this strategy, awareness of the issues facing care experienced people and the support and entitlements available to them has been improved amongst our frontline staff across HMPPS. And efforts are also being made to further our understanding of those in our care who have care experience by commissioning our own research. We have quite a bit of that going on at the moment, and also inviting like partners and academic professionals to really contribute to development and delivery in this area. So At the moment, we've got a number of projects looking at improving our systems, strengthening collaborative work, and supporting care experience people in general. So the purpose of the strategy is really to kind of build on these key achievements to really embed a coherent and standardised approach to improving outcomes for care experience people in the criminal justice system. So research, such as what you're about to hear being presented today, will really help us to understand the cohort better and meet our ambitions. But very quickly, because I know that you are dying to hear the research, what I would like to say is that we really want to kind of consolidate and reaffirm our commitment to care experience people. So we are actually in the process of launching a new resource that really helps prison and probation staff and local authority leaving care staff to develop fruitful partnerships and work to improve outcomes for this group. So this resource is called Care Experience Matters, a guide to how prisons, probation and local authorities can work together to support people with care experience in custody and on probation. So this kind of guidance document is based very heavily on what care experience people in the criminal justice system through various conversations and forums have told us will help them. And I think that is key. So it does cover all the statutory requirements, but also gives targeted advice in key areas where care experience people have told us that they want help, such as financial support, clothing, release and resettlement, and it gives advice on bespoke approaches for helping care experience women, foreign national offenders over 25s, the youth custody service, and some considerations around DNI. So absolutely watch this space. It will be launched on the intranet soon, and it will also go up onto Equip. So now to the presentations themselves. You'll hear again from me in the Q&A section. You'll see that Wayne's put some instructions in the chat, but let me reiterate very, very quickly. So throughout the session, you can use the chat function to ask questions that you have for the panelists. And at the end of the session, we'll put as many of these as we can to the panel. And it would really help me out if you could specify if you want one particular panelist to answer your question. But if we do miss your question, don't worry, we'll send out a Q&A document after the event. So now I'm going to hand over to Debbie to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks for that, Lindsay. And I'm not going to any further ado. So I'm just delighted actually to introduce you all to Charlotte Elliott, who from Affinity 2020, who is going to now have her opening remarks and give you some insights into the work that she's doing. So thank you very much, Charlie.
No, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. You'll notice at the bottom of my first slide, I've put a simple head teacher, because that's all I am. I'm a simple head teacher. That's what I spent the last 10 years doing before I set up Affinity 2020. I worked in urban challenging environments nationally within contexts and schools that had got themselves, let's say, in a bit of a pickle. Next slide, please. So these are kind of the stats that we've been throwing around, and they always seem so dour and so down. And I just want to say at the start that we work with some fantastic professionals at Affinity, particularly Rotherham Children's Services, such a dedicated group of professionals who think outside the box. And we know that there are tremendous professionals working with our young people, but still, we are still seeing these outcomes nationally, where 38% of our young people are NEET, premature death rates are high, and 5A star to C, including English and maths, is not in line with their non-care experienced peers. Now, I started with that slide because me and my team looked at it and said there must be another way around. There is so much statutory responsibility that sometimes it can stifle innovation. Is there a way that we can help our colleagues across the system, because we are in a space as a CIC to actually innovate and research and see whether those things happen? So I'm going to take you through a bit of a journey with Affinity, with a different kind of, we call them curriculums. Many people like to say services or programs, but we refer to them as curriculums, because again, I'll go back to the simple head teacher. That's kind of what we know. So next slide, please. So when we started with Reframe, we had this feeling from our young people that they didn't have identity, belonging, decision-making capacity, was somewhat short. What do you want to do with your future? And all the team was trained in life story work. And we were like, this is absolutely superb. We really, really enjoyed our life story training. Then we started to talk to our young people, and they said, our memories and what we actually process don't come to us in a chronological way, because we know trauma affects time. And we started to talk to the young people and ask them, and they said, it's like a film, Charlie, that plays in our heads. And then the images sit there. And what we kind of found is, obviously, and please correct me, anybody out there that's wrong, that I'm wrong, in the right side of the brain, you can sit with your images and your memories, and they just come. And the front side of your left-hand side of the brain is very linear and list orientated. And our young people were having trouble actually kind of putting the chronology together with their memories and actually the visions that they were actually seeing of time. And what has happened to them was like, there's got to be a way around this. We were also seeing our young people going for jobs and going into education and doing quite a lot of people pleasing. Yes, I'll do that. That sounds good, because of the people were saying, I think this will be really good for you. And then there was a dropout rate, or they were becoming inconsistent. So again, we started to work through, what is this that's happening? What can we do about this? And we actually found that a lot of our young people did not have their own established, we call it their personal narrative. We all have personal narratives. Our experiences in life create who we are today and what we believe, what our values are and how we operate. And our young people would come to us and say, I'm care experienced. Oh, and I have this mental health condition. And we say, okay, so what music do you like? Where are you at with that? And they were like, oh, and I said, we need to start establishing this personal myth, this personal narrative with our young people. We developed Reframe, which is now central to my colleague Liz Churton's PhD, which will be completed in 2 years' time. Part of Reframe is using a creative process to start to understand self. So our young people start with the tree of life, and everything goes there. It could be images, it could be collage, it could be doodling. It's anything that they want to try and talk to us about their past, present and future. And as we work to kind of fill this tree, the bottom half is around their past experiences, the middle half is around what they're experiencing now, and the top half is what their future looks like. And from using this tree, which is highly visual, we take our young people into what we call the hero's journey. Now, some people might have heard about this. It's the way that blockbuster films are written. The Hunger Games is an absolutely brilliant example of the hero's journey. So from this place, we then create a character. This character, 9 times out of 10, is actually themselves, but they've created somebody else that they're talking to us about or through. And we take this hero on this huge journey where they have talismans, they have challenges, they overcome their obstacles. And as they come out the other side, they've actually come over what they were thinking internally that they could never come over. And they have this piece of beautiful creative work, and we're really open about what that creative work looks like. Now, some of the impacts that we've seen have been quite significant. We had a young person joined us and was really struggling with friendship groups at school and really struggling with identity and what their next steps were going to be, what they wanted to do at college, all those really, really important facets. So we decided at the middle of having some discussions around those next steps while we were being creative. Our young person fed back to us that they went and attended college and went to an interview and loved it. They've applied for the college course. They now talk about their established friendship groups and that they have boundaries and barriers and they understand what they stand for. And they feel more comfortable with saying to some of their friends, I don't want to talk tonight on the iPad till 3 in the morning because I need to sleep, because that's what I need. Another one of our young person who came to us had a couple of stalled attempts, let's say at level 3 education, and came to us and worked through the process again, and is like, no, this is what I want to do now, this is who I stand for, and is able to articulate their journey
very, very confidently and who they are. So today this young person actually phoned me and said, I've met another artist today. I said, have you? And what did you talk about? She said, I talked about Reframe, and now that I know who I am and what I stand for and what I believe in. So by working through what is seen as their flashing memories that occur to them all the time, we're able to stabilise those memories, contextualise those memories, and actually draw them down into what is a very creative plan and help them to process those memories. Now, some of Reframe has come from what you can see in front of you. We do extensive literature reviews. So Reframe itself, there was about 50 different elements that we actually did a reviews of to pull things together. If you haven't read The Body Keeps the Score, it's absolutely sensational. It's a fantastic read. And it's absolutely right that survivors can't recover until they become familiar and befriend the sensations in their bodies. And we do a lot of this with Reframe. We know the amygdala within the brain of our young person is always in high alert most of the time. We call it their burglar alarm. And it just goes off when it doesn't need to go off because there's a perceived threat. And they can't do anything else because they go into survival mode until that perceived threat's gone. So we talk to them a lot about when you feel that in your body, that your burglar alarm may be activated and there might not be any threat right now. What does that feel like? So they become very comfortable with articulating that. James D. West, he says it really, listing chronological events is not a story. And I think that's really important for our young people because they have lots of chronology to try and help them understand their journeys. But actually in their own head, they see their journeys through their memories in that side of the brain that comes at them at different points. So how do we actually then assimilate a story or a plot about what they're seeing and what they've experienced? And the other one about Dan P. McAdams, personal myths are the making of self. I bet there's so many people on the call now that can actually say, this is my personal narrative, this is what I stand for. This is what I believe in. This is what I enjoy doing. This is what I don't like enjoying doing. And most of our young people now that we're working with through Reframe, when they're talking to us, it's more about the positivity of the experiences that they have experienced through the care system than actually the negative impacts, because they're seeing how those experiences are shaping who they are. Next slide, please. Oh, I think we might have skipped a slide. Yes, I think we have. We need to, let's, yes, I don't know why it's not come through. Anyway, so what happened then was we started to look at learning because we're head teachers, and we started to notice that our young people were having a real struggle around literacy, particularly dense texts. And our national curriculum is full of dense texts. And so it should be, because it is a joy to read, and it should be a joy to read. But myself and Liz were noticing particularly the processing of non-linear texts. So a really good example of that is To Kill a Mockingbird. There's a scene in To Kill a Mockingbird where there is a person stood in the court dock as a witness, talking about their present state, but reflecting on their past state and what happened. And we know that trauma affects time. We see this with survivors trying to actually piece together what has happened to them, whether that be through a car accident or that they've survived elements of criminality, that they can't, and difficult to sequence what happened. So then we're putting texts in front of our young people that do just that. And we wonder why they're running out of the classroom. So myself and Liz sat in one sunny July and went, there's got to be a way around this. But what is it that's happening? So we started to talk to our young people. They were like, no, get that text away from me. I'm like, what is wrong with that text? It's just too much written. No. And we tried another young person, but what about this one? There's a little bit more of visual elements in there or non-visual elements in there. And they were like, actually, I'm starting to understand that. So we started to supply some of our young people with graphic novels. And we started to see this change in them, that actually were picking up these graphic novels. And I was like, what is going on? Have we got here a visual and spatial aspect or perception that's more enhanced because they've actually experienced trauma? There's something bypassing within the learning elements of the brain that means they're processing information in a very different way. So we started to work with a group of teachers. We were funded by the Paul Hamlin Foundation, and we did a year-long piece of research with these teachers. And I started straight away in the first session, and I said, what adaptive pedagogy do you have in your classroom for young people that are care experienced? And the teachers came out with beautiful things. Oh, they get sensory time in the sensory room. They get time with a learning mentor. They get time with a key worker, where they come in a little bit later in the morning. I went, lovely. What do you do in your classroom? Because while we're talking about a sense of identity and belonging, those interventions remove our young people away from their peer group. So what do you do as a teacher? And all of them went, oh, we've never looked at it like this. So we went over some of our research around visual and spatial perception and what we're seeing from our young people, particularly understanding complex text. So I've got 3 kind of short case studies to talk through. So there was one lady called Jackie, superb primary teacher, really was. And she summed it up in a nutshell. She said, I think I've just experienced what some of our young people experience in one of our sessions. I said, go on. She went, I set my classroom up. She said, I've got a French teacher online in France. I've got all the resources set up, all the young people ready to go, and all the IT crashed. She said, I literally wanted to run out of the classroom, go inside the tent in the sensory room and cry. She says, my amygdala just went into absolute free fall. And I thought, what do I do here? What do I? And I said, so what's that made you think about? So she developed a way to remove the fear and anxiety of what was coming next in learning, particularly literacy. She created this beautiful roadmap, which is on one of the slides, I think. I need to double check. And it's a construction. It's got a roundabout in the middle with all these lovely kind of facets coming off, and the young people could Velcro on and off what was coming next with their literacy. So they're spatially and visually processing. She says, so here's me at the front chirping away all auditory wise. She says, and wondering why my young people are just sat going, I don't know what it is you want me to do. She says, by adding that visual in, she says the young people started to work independently in their literacy lessons on moving, physically moving the tabs, physically moving things around and then going into their books. She also said that the carers spoke to her and said that actually they were seeing less resistance to coming to school, particularly to her lessons. It was easier for the young people to get up and come to school. They were looking forward to it. So she continued with this, and we call it a metacognitive approach, learning how to learn. But she's done it in a very visual way, and she's continued with that practice. And she said, I don't think now I'll ever look at this in a different way, that I have to use adaptations within my pedagogy as I would with other young people when they have different elements of how they process. Beth is an early years teacher, and she had a group of little ones who were care experienced, and she couldn't get them anywhere near the literacy area at all. It was just complete shutdown, walk away. And when literacy tasks were coming up, exactly the same. I'm just going to go outside, or I'm going to go into the water tray area. I don't want to do this. So she developed and looked at what we call see, think, wonder. So she would get some pictorial cards out that were around the book that they were studying, and she'd just sit there and ask them to think about what they think is going off. Then she'd say, what do you see is going off? And they'd articulate what they would see. And then she said to them, now I want you to wonder what you think happens next. She says, and I couldn't believe it. She said the young people started to pick up the books. They were lining up for their see, think, wonder sessions. She says they were over in the literacy corner. She says they were asking me about words. She said, so she'd found again that visual and spatial perception was really enhanced, and that if she could integrate that into the practice, it was then leading into the journey of actually picking up books and looking at books. One of the last case studies, before I talk about my own, because I was part of it as well, is Anne's story. Anne was a TA, and Anne said, I work across the school, so it's really quite challenging for me. And she said, and looking at the different ways that literacy actually works, she said, she started to build interactive displays. She did these beautiful displays across the school. I mean, so artistic and creative, but she said, care experience young people were just wandering past. She said, just not interested at all. So she started to add icons into the displays, and these icons were kind of questioning marks or elements that prompted questions within the display. And she said, I started to observe the young people, they were stopping and engaging with the literacy displays. She's purely seeing these icons just made them stop and then start to look at and talk with their friends about the questions that were on the walls. So again, great visual and spatial perception coming through, and then leading to what was happening next in their literacy lessons and developing that kind of passion, I suppose, for being confident enough to pick up books. My own personal research was really interesting. So bearing in mind that a lot of our young people do not get the right qualifications to transfer over onto apprenticeships, which is always really, really worrying, because you think, you know, if they're really spatial and they're really hands-on, apprenticeships are always a good pathway. We designed a qualification called Preparing for Adulthood, and I worked with a group of care leavers through our traineeship programme to actually look at the curriculum. I said, there is writing involved, there is maths involved. And what we started to notice was, especially with the young people, the more highly visual and less auditory the examples were that we were giving, the more independent they were about actually getting on and doing the tasks. So every single day we set up highly visual PowerPoints and said, this is kind of what we're going to work on today. And 9 times out of 10, they didn't need any input. They knew exactly what they needed to do. Now, at the start, I did a traditional kind of PowerPoint approach that kind of shoved that much writing as you'd have in a traditional school context. And people are like, I don't know what I'm doing. What am I doing? Can you explain to me? I don't know. What is this? So again, we were seeing this really highly developed visual and spatial perception. We know, don't we, from the hippocampi at the back, that it can be rebuilt. The neurons can keep firing and be rebuilt in that if we've got great diet, exercise and cognitive challenge. And this is where our research is built. If the brain doesn't have cognitive challenge, where do we go? If our young people are being excluded from the school system, or the school system that can't fully engage with the school system, where does that cognitive challenge come from for them? I think in the last kind of section that I want to talk about today, it's about time is really green shoots. So what we did with the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, it's really, really green shoots, but we're seeing practitioners starting to apply this. Our Looked After Council in Rotherham were given quite a dense report about social justice. And Lisa Duval, who's an incredible professional who works with the Looked After Council, she's the Looked After Council lead, started to present some of this very dense text in a more visual way, and noticed that the Looked After Council were able to articulate their thoughts and feelings on this very dense text. And she said they felt really comfortable with sharing their views. And she managed working actually with corporate services to transfer some of that work into a more visual format, so it was accessible for our young people. We've got a journey in front of us at Affinity to kind of consolidate this more, to look to wider professionals, to be involved with initial teacher training, because one of the things that we've noticed is initial teacher training, while we're training professionals, doesn't have any discrete training around adaptive pedagogical practice for care experienced people. We focus on people with SEN, English as an additional language, you know, summer-born children, but we have no kind of units in place at the moment that focus on this as a different way that young people may learn. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. I hope I've not rambled too much for everyone, because I can do that, and I can see that Stephen's ready, hopefully, and we're going to hand over to Stephen. I'm going to do a little bit of a Q&A with Stephen. I'm going to ask Stephen some questions, and he's going to respond beautifully, as he always does. Would you like to introduce yourself, Stephen?
Yeah, so I'm Stephen Hawksworth. I'm a senior child protection social worker in sunny Wakefield. No, you're not hearing me, Charlie?
Can we hear Stephen?
Right, we've got thumbs up. We're good to go. That's fine.
I can hear him, Charlie.
So I'm Stephen Hawksworth. I'm a senior child protection social worker in Wakefield. I've been a social worker now for 3 years, so 3 years too long. And I grew up in foster care, so I spent all of my childhood in the foster care system from 0 until 25 when I left the care system then. So yeah, over to you, Charlotte.
So one of the questions that I'd like to ask Stephen is, what worked for you when you were learning new knowledge in an educational context? How did teachers adapt their pedagogy?
So I had a lot of intervention from virtual school from day dot really. So I had like tutors in most subjects. There were no kind of assumption that I weren't going to get that support, and there was a lot of belief that we're capable of a lot more really. I did struggle a lot with, I know you've touched upon it, written texts where they were bulky. I just couldn't get my head around it, I'll be honest. And even presently today, I do better with more the visual and simple language and stuff like that. And that's even been through like my PhD that I'm doing now. It has to be like that.
So the next one is, you know, do you use now as an adult in your social work practice anything that's kind of highly visual and spatial? So when you come to do any sort of reports or anything, is there anything that you need where you think that really works for me?
Yeah, so when I'm doing my reports, and in particular my parenting assessment sessions that we do, I do a lot with visual cards. So it'll be a basic diagram of, I don't know, cleaning, cooking, whatever. And I'll discuss that with the parent, and they'll pick out and they understand more clearly, because social work jargon is complex and it's not inclusive. And I think that's across the board with kind of different services of, we do a lot more simpler stuff, and it seems to be greater received with the families because they seem to understand that better than your traditional ways.
And the next one is, obviously you've seen education as a way to create the life that you want. You're doing your PhD, and I know that you're on another fast track program with social work at the moment that you're due to start next year. Who supported you with seeing that? And if nobody did support you with seeing that, how did you come to that conclusion that education was massively important?
Well, thankfully I had quite a good support system. So my foster carers were very much, this is what you're going to do. It wasn't you're going to sit at home and do nothing. It was very much, education is your way out of a life that could have been really. And I think because my family weren't into education, like my mum and stuff like that, I just wanted normality. That's all it was. I just wanted to be the same as everyone else. Like, I didn't want anything different. I just wanted to be able to live a normal life where I weren't relying on intervention. I just wanted to be Stephen, who's just a normal person. But yeah, my teachers were good. My social worker were good. At virtual school, like they absolutely changed everything. So for me, it was a good experience. Like, if I didn't have the education I had now, I dread to think. But it's changed my life forever. So.
And the last one, as a practicing social worker, what adaptations do you use when sharing dense texts yourself? And I know you touched on that earlier, that you use the picture card.
So what we do with, in particular with children, we do different versions of the plans. So I've had plans where one young person wanted it to be on a football, so I wrote the plan on the football, and then that he could go back to that football all the time and understand more freely about, this is what we're doing, this is the plan, this is how we achieve it. And the way that we wrote the plan as well was to the child. So the language were very simple, but it would be directly to the child, and we found that were more, I'd say, hard hitting to the parents, but they seem to get it a lot more, and the impact that it can have on the children without this plan being achieved.
And if you take away this kind of visual and spatial aids that you use, what do you think would happen in that context if all that was removed and you had to stick to a practice that was kind of, no, I've got to write this, I've got to present this in a written format? What kind of impacts do you think you would see?
I think you'd see less success for the families. So you've got to think the plans that we do are not for us, they're for the children and the families, aren't we? And I think if they don't understand them, then how on earth are you going to achieve it? Mm-hmm. You know, it's not about being oppressive, it's about making sure that your work that you do is inclusive and that everyone can access it. And I think it's about not making assumptions that people have a great understanding of what you're doing. So I think if you're keeping it simple for people, it means you're getting a wider range of audience, aren't you? And that your outcomes are going to be greater for the children. So
And I know we've spoken, haven't we, many times about we both need to see things before we're asked to kind of do them. I'm neurodivergent, I have dyslexia, so I need to see things. If somebody was to give me a blank sheet of paper and say, can you write a commission? And I haven't seen one, that's really, really challenging. And yourself, Stephen, you mentioned earlier that you need to see things. What happens to you if you don't see things before you're actually asked to fill them in?
So I think if I don't see them, then I get like a mental block on it. It becomes quite overwhelming. And I'll learn better by someone doing it with me the first time. So showing me kind of this is what we do, this is how it is. And it's like teach me once and I'll go do it. But it becomes overwhelming and I can't get it done.
That's the kind of questions. I mean, we can hand over nicely to some questions from anybody that's got anything from the chat. And thank you, Stephen.
All right.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Stephen. So, yeah, that's great. I'll just hand over now to Lindsay, who's going to chair the Q&A section of this event. Lindsay?
Sure. Thanks very much, and thank you so much to Charlie and Stephen for some fantastic conversations there. It hasn't ignited many questions in the chat. I'm sure people are warming up, and don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, I am not going to make you go on camera or say it out loud or anything like that. Oh, Gethin has actually come in with one now, which is fabulous. He has said, and I'm just going to have to scroll up very gently. This is great at stopping the education care to prison pipeline. My question is, how would you have reached someone from care in prison who was excluded at a very young age and has custody experience from 14 to 15? Would any of our panelists like to pick up on that?
So how would we reach them? I would start with creative conversations, is what we call them first. I would start with a creative activity, whatever it is that young person is interested in, and start with the talk then that goes with it. Oh, what is that? What are you thinking about doing? Very open questions. As teachers, if you're not good at questioning, you're bad at teaching, is what we say. And how do you kind of balance what we call the Macaulay Culkin effect, where you can feel like you're asking 100 questions in Uncle Buck and people don't want to? So how you do, well, what we particularly do is have an activity that is running alongside that has a creative outlet to it that then sparks those conversations starting. Stephen, is there anything that you...
No, I just think it's showing an interest in young person's life, really. And I think if you go guns in with learning side of it, it's not going to happen. It takes time, and it's all about relationships and that kind of, as you know, with like your Maslow theory and all that kind of stuff, you need to be secure before that the rest of it comes into place.
Fantastic. Debbie, do you have any reflections on that, or should we move on?
I think it's okay to move on, but I think Gethin's put just a follow up on that, where he's saying, and I had a similar kind of think, is that that what you've kind of described looks like it would work really well for younger people. And I was wondering exactly what Gethin said as well, that he's thinking, how would it work for someone that might be in their 30s now? And I was thinking a similar thing, that some of the language that you've been using, like the hero's journey and stuff like that, I don't know how that would work, but actually Gethin's, do you want to come on camera, Gethin?
Yeah, I am on camera here. I'll tell you the reason for why I'll say it, so I travel around the UK on care experience, prison experience. I went into custody at the age of 14 from care, and at the age of 15, the courts actually said there was nothing more they could do for me, and I got remanded into prison rather than the care of the local authority. But I was in Gartree this week, and I was speaking to a gentleman in there who's a lifer prisoner. He's done lots of jail before. Our experience as a care sort of like exactly the same. He's probably done 20 plus years behind the door, and he won't engage in any therapeutic, educational or things like that. And I completely understand it, because he's been so burnt and beaten by the system from such a young age. It's that group that I'm kind of really concerned about, and it's about how do we reach them. I know how to reach them, but it's about how we can facilitate that, because say my idea is that actually it's about the developing and building the relationship and having the opportunity and space to be able to create a human to human relationship. Yeah, because most of them will not trust the system, and understandably so. And what I say to them is, I still don't trust the system today because it's broken. But what I do trust is individuals that work within it, and it's about how we can develop them relationships like what you're talking about, so that we can really sort of like start to understand that person, yeah, and then be able to create something that's going to work for them. So that's just really why I'm wanting to answer, because I love what you're doing and I get it, and I'm exactly the same as your friend. I work in lots of areas. I can't read reports. They just drive me nuts. When I work with youngsters or other people, I'm always drawing pictures. It's how I communicate. I understand it. But it's how you do that in an adult context and teach people in the prison system to do that. So I'll shut up now.
We worked with, when we were developing Reframe, one of our associates, Rob, and Rob doesn't mind me talking about his story, and he's actually cultivating to share his story a lot wider. Rob was in the care system in the 50s, and he was placed in the care system because he was dual heritage and his mum was white. So huge amounts of trauma that he experienced. And when we were working with Rob through Reframe, and Rob is in his 60s, we use storytelling methodology is what we did. We said, it's telling your story. You want to get out there what happened. You don't want it ever to happen to anybody else again. So we approached it with an adult storytelling perspective. And then that's when the engagement started with, how do I represent this? And then he started with, well, this is how I see this. And he started to kind of draw it. Well, this is the words that I'd like in there. So the perspective of storytelling really has quite a powerful impact with adults, because I think a lot of people want to help others to never ever the experiences that they've had. And they have to draw on those experiences to be able to tell their own story. I hope that's helpful.
We've actually got a question from Cheska, who's happy to come on camera. So Cheska, would you like to go ahead?
Can everyone hear me?
Certainly can.
Yeah, not on camera, just my voice is all you're going to
Sure.
get. I've got a first-hand experience of the care system, and I work in the third sector for an arts charity that I set up, which works in prisons and with young adults in care. The reason I wanted to speak is because I struggle as well at times to write down, to try and get it out of my head. I'm just wondering, I'm finding this really interesting from other research I've done as well. Is there any evidence, or because the care system's so multifaceted and so complex, and each individual's experience is so varied, is there any evidence around the impact of being in the care system from, for example, from being born, or to going into it at 5 years old, or to going into it as a teenager? So it's more, my question is there any clear links between level of impact and trauma to how long somebody spent in it? Is there anything around that? You know, listening to Stephen, you know, saying he's in the care system for 25 years. And if I compare myself, I was in the care system for 3 years, but it depends when you class the care system as ending. I just got a council flat at 17 and that was it for me. So yeah, I'm just interested if there's anything around length of time or any other research you could direct me to.
I think the research you probably need to look at is the Body Holds the Score, the book that we talked about, because lengths of time, depending on how long that you're processing the trauma that you've been through. Some people are in a space where they can process and move forward in a different time space to somebody who can't. And I think if you look at the facets of the Body Holds the Score, it tells you that until you've processed what it is that actually resulted in care experience, actually it could be with you forever and a long time. And it's not necessarily a therapeutic outlet. Liz Churton, who works alongside Affinity, she noticed she's care experienced herself. She was brought up by her nan because of great mental health difficulties in her mum and dad's life. And she said her trauma happened younger, but then actually her trauma happened when she was in her late 50s. She said it all came back again. I nearly lost my mum. I nearly lost my partner. She said the house flooded. She said everything came back at me. She said, and I'd been a highly functioning head for over 15 years and thought that I'd processed what had gone off in my life. She said, and then all this happened to me at the same time and it hit me again. And she realised she'd not actually processed any of it and it was still with her. So she's been processing that over the last 4 years herself and understanding that.
I think it's, I completely agree, and I'll definitely look into it. It's more, as we're a charity and a third party, with the constant fight for funding, they want measurable, hard stats, clear outcomes. They don't, you know, they want us to work with 300 kids, or young adults, all across the same level when they all need different levels. I might need to work with 2 people intensively for 5 years, whereas other people might only need a more softer touch depending on, again, it's all kind of linked to trauma and what level you are. I just didn't know if you had anything around.
Well, we use, I don't know if anybody's probably heard of them, the Warwick Wellbeing Scales.
Yeah.
We use them an awful lot because
Yeah.
actually they are something that you can have a measurable with, and they are not cumbersome on the young person or the adult that you might be working with thinking, I'm being monitored. I don't want to be monitored. So we use that quite a bit to look at impact over time. And we also have very set KPIs in that respect that don't impact on the young people that they're working with. They don't know they're there.
Yeah.
That's how we use them.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that question. I'm conscious people have got their hands up, but I'm going to go to the written questions in the chat so we're not missing people, and just in case people do need to jump off, but do keep your hands up and I'll get to you. So there's a question from Matthew Sullivan. What is the size of the sample of students that you've worked with, Charlotte? Aside from the genetic adaptations to include more visual stimuli, shouldn't teachers be equipped to respond to students' specific needs, which will differ from person to person? Isn't knowing your student the key to effective teaching and learning?
It is. Knowing your student is a key to effective teaching and learning. But sometimes teachers don't know who's care experienced in their class because of the structure of the system. We've had this a few times from teachers and we've said to them, ask who they are. And they've gone up to their safeguarding leads and said, do I have care experienced children in my class? I need to know this information. And sometimes there is a response from the sector that I was in, this is a need to know. So sometimes it's quite challenging in that respect. You have to have very curious professionals that want to ask those questions and make sure that they do know who their care experienced young people are in their class. In regards to teachers being equipped, and knowing their students and making sure that they've got a visual approach. Again, you don't know that the care experience, you don't know where to look. You may assimilate that, oh, has that child got SEN needs? Is that child experiencing something different? So I think it's about information sharing. In regards to the cross-section of young people that we've worked with, it is a small sample. It's about 25 young people. And this is really green shoots research that we're seeing at the moment rather than anything that's longitudinal. And we've only worked for a year on this. And there's still a huge piece of work to come. And we would welcome anybody who would like to look at this further with us, contacting us and actually really having a more in-depth view and a more in-depth look at what this looks like and how this can be transferred into pedagogy. I hope that's helpful.
I'm sure it is. Thank you very much indeed. I saw a question in the chat and I'm struggling to find it now because there's been a lot of conversation. So I'm just doing a wee bit of scrolling back, but I believe it was, do we have any top tips for prison officers and probation officers in engaging with this cohort? Now, there is an obvious answer here from mine and Debbie's perspective, but I would like to allow Charlie and Stephen to have a say on that first.
Stephen, do you want to go before me?
No, go on, I'll give you the privilege first.
I would say for engaging, it's the time and space to listen. One of the biggest things that our young people say to us all the time is having the time and space for somebody just to listen. And that's really important to them. And I know we're all kind of in a very time sensitive environment. And obviously from education perspective, stuff has to be done on time. We've got to get this done. Our workload's absolutely huge. But particularly my young people have said just having the time for somebody just to listen. It's really good for them to start with. Over to you, Stephen.
I think my big one is just to treat people the same. Like I always used to sense if people were treating me differently and I felt segregated because I was in care. And I think kind of you do sense it. You sense that you're different. But it's like, I don't want to be different. I want to be the same. So I think that kind of consistency and kind of repetition as well. And we've all mentioned it, relationships, but it's fundamental for progress is relationships.
Thank you for that, Stephen. That's brilliant. So Debbie, I would like you now to reflect, and perhaps you could tell the prison and probation staff on the call a bit more about Care Experience Matters, because I mean I touched on it briefly in my introduction, but perhaps you could put some flesh on the bones, because that could be the key document that really does help engagement with this group. Peter has been waiting very patiently to ask his question. So Peter, would you like to come on, Mike?
I'll be honest, it wasn't quite a question. It was one thing, if Cheska's still here, just a response to Cheska about any research. There's one bit of research that might be helpful in terms of the impact of various different elements in a child's care experience on overall outcomes. Now, it was based in education, so I'm a virtual head, so that's why I know about this particular piece. So if you were to look up the Reece Centre report on educational outcomes, I think that's what it's called. I'll see if I can find it and pop it in the chat as well. But that was a longitudinal piece of work, which means it went back in time. So they looked at, I think, sort of 15 years worth of results and then followed the children all the way through. And I don't know how, it was like sort of some kind of statistical wizardry. I don't know quite how they did it, but then we're able to isolate each individual thing. So it might be care placement moves, age of time coming into care, time spent in care, type of care placements, and a number of different things like that, and what the overall outcome was on their number and percentages of GCSE grades, if that makes sense. So it's kind of, you know, this coming into care at this stage has a third of a GCSE grade impact across all subjects, or something like that, is how they kind of did that piece of research. So it may work in terms of providing you with some of the answers around some of those impacts of different elements of the care system on a specific outcome. That's one piece of research that is held up as one of the strongest pieces of research, because it's thousands of care experienced children have been, young people and adults have been involved in that, because they went back over, you know, it was a piece of research over 20 or 30 years history they went back over, if that makes sense. So then that would be really, really useful. It might be a useful resource to you in answering some of those questions. And just to back up what Charlie's saying in terms of those, using the different elements of storytelling, relational work, the visual and the spatial, finding all the different, you know, as many different ways to reach our young people, so that we, you know, starting with what we know about them and then what works for them is absolutely vital. We're doing a piece of work around reading to our young people at the minute, but that's to our teenagers and 16 to 18-year-olds, to try and get, you know, some of that may have been missed out earlier, to develop their, sort of improve their reading ability. So whilst we work on the visual stuff, also trying to stretch the other as well.
Thank you for that. I'm sure that is really, really helpful. Gethin, do you have another question or a comment to make, or is that an old hand?
No, it is a new one. It's just a comment, really. It goes back to what Charlie was saying in relation to the schools, and I think prison can learn to do this as well. You know, because sometimes it's not just about the care experienced children in schools. It's also the ones that aren't being taken and looked after by the social care system because of thresholds and everything. But I always go back to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs when we think about education. You know, if you think about the foundation, it's about having their basic needs met. Yeah. Just whether there's like a warmth and shelter, you know, then they got to have their physical needs met, you know, are they kind of being done? And then you've got the emotional on top of that, and that's the foundation. And if they haven't got that, they're not going to be in a place to want to be able to learn, develop, and kind of grow in that area. And that's also the same as what we've been trying to do in prisons for a long time, with the rehabilitation rehab culture, you know, which Ruth Mann kind of set up. And when you look at the principles from that, they're exactly the same principles of hierarchy of needs. Yeah, first of all, we need to take care of the environment. Yeah, then we need to have the right staff in place that can kind of deliver the nurture, the support, the care, the emotional development. Then we can then start to look at what's led somebody to prison. You know, so I think education and also prison still have got a bit of a learning curve to get them foundations right first there. Yeah, so that everything got there so that we can actually help them, you know, because it is like you say, the teachers, they're trying to teach in the school because of Ofsted, yeah, and everything else, but actually they don't even know what's going on for their own children. Yeah, they've got 30 children in the class, they don't know who's in care, they don't know who's one's going home to an alcoholic father or mother. Yeah, they don't know who's going home to witness domestic abuse. They don't know this stuff because they're not having time to get to know their children, which is coming back to that bit we said at the beginning, is about we're all human beings. Yeah, it's about relationships with people. So yeah, so it's just more of a comment and an opportunity for me to bang the brush, whatever it is.
Well, thank you so much for that, Gethin. That's fantastic. So I actually spotted something that came up in the comments, and somebody has answered that. It's from Chris Holmes, and do prison and probation officers get any entry-level training on the impact of CARE experience and working with CARE experienced people? I can say from the probation side, it is not included, and not included enough. It's touched upon in the early probation practitioner training, the PQIP programme, but not in as much depth as I would personally like. So what I tend to do is I personally go around different probation units in the country to give a presentation on a kind of an overview of you know, what is CARE experience and some of the impacts that CARE experience can have on somebody's life and choices. That is not a perfect way of doing it. And it's something that I'm actively trying to address. So when the next iteration of PQIP training comes up for renewal, I'm hoping to get something a bit more substantial in there. Debbie, you produced a training package for prison officers that's on the intranet. Would you like to discuss that briefly?
Yeah, I can mention it briefly because we all go, don't we, when we think of e-learning packages. But it was developed actually in consultation with somebody with experience of both prison and the care system. So it's kind of based around their story really, and how we can better understand how those experiences then later impact. So there is an e-learning package. It's not ideal because you know, it is difficult for staff to find the time to sit down, and it's about 45 minutes to sit down and do an e-learning package. But it's what we've got, and you know, and I will say this: we've had lots of conversations with learning and development. And I'm sorry if there's anyone from learning and development on the call, but please phone me, because we have had those discussions about getting it into entry-level prison officer training, because it is important for all the reasons I've said at the start. You know, it's a high percentage of our population. They're our most complex people often. They are people where their outcomes are poorer. So for all of those reasons, we need to understand them better, and people need to be aware both that they exist, because I didn't after 25 years, and also what support is available for them. So we have off the bat, rather than do it kind of through the new prison officer training, I have been to speak to new prison officers, and I do deliver my own training package, which does go down very well. It only takes 45 minutes or so, but it gets this group known, so people are then aware that they do exist. So yeah, again, we've got a few training packages, so you know, I am always happy to come out and speak to people and do those training packages, but in the ideal world it needs to be embedded in our initial training.
Okie dokie, thank you very much for that, Debbie. Tina in the chat bar has said, any advice for pre-sentence report authors in court on what to consider in their assessments when interviewing someone with CARE experience? They have to develop reports quite quickly, so not always easy. Any research that would be helpful? Charlie and Stephen, would you like to come in on that?
Stephen, do you want to answer that one?
Because you do a lot of report writing in very short spaces
Don't
of
do
time.
Don't do them type of ones. Obviously, it's difficult with all times that you've got against you, but I think what I've found is when I've been working with care experience parents in particular, so they're very suspicious of why you're involved and what your purpose is, and they don't. What I found, they don't like retelling the history that's happened. So I think it's getting a good understanding of why they're in care, all that kind of stuff, and then going back to the kind of visual side when you're doing the assessments, and making it, because they need that report. Obviously, I appreciate it's for court as well, but it's making sure that they fully understand what's in that report so that they can act upon that.
And I would say you might, I know you've got to kind of type these assessment reports out in short spaces of time, but think about some icons that may trigger people to answer questions that you need for the assessment. So using the icon of a question mark rather than saying answering that question, some questions are coming up so they can actually visually see what might be happening next in that assessment report. So their mind is ready to go, right, I'm going on to that next, and I know I'm going to have to be answering this in this way. Icons, we use quite a lot of icons within Affinity to prompt questions and answers.
Thank you very much. I mean, what I'll come in from the probation side of this, Tina. I mean, like for people on the call who don't know what a pre-sentence report is, it's a very, very rigid structured document with a number of sections that have to be filled in to be presented within the court environment. And a key area, and you'll know this yourself, Tina, it'll be like teaching your granny to suck eggs, really, is experience of trauma. There is a full section on experience of trauma. You may well find that an individual is not quite comfortable with opening up to you initially at that early stage of being within the criminal justice system. You're a new person, you're a new authority figure. They may well be sizing you up to see if you can be trusted, for example, to work in their best interests. So even if the individual just merely states that they are care experience, make sure you put that under the experience of trauma section to highlight that there is potentially experience of trauma there. We can't make assumptions, of course. So that could potentially help the court. What I will say to you as well is that I myself have a meeting with the equalities lead in the Central Court team to see if there's anything that we can do together to help improve advice that court report writers are given. And that's actually going to be an action in a renewed strategy that's coming up for renewal in the new year. So there will be a full work stream around improving things from the court side, and you know, what can we do in our more administrative project management roles to support that, is, you know, including potentially commissioning research in this area, and also improving kind of practice guidance. But something that I will beg of anybody on this call who writes court reports is to please, if you have the opportunity, please log on in Delius that the person is care experienced, and ensure if the person has been given a custodial sentence, it may well not be the report writer that does this, but someone else in the court team. Ensure that that message is passed on to the receiving prison as well, to ensure that the person can be supported while they're in custody, because we really do need to work hard to make sure that those links are linking, frankly. So thank you very, very much for that question. I'm briefly scrolling through the chats here. There has been quite a number of different things coming up. Let me see. Beg your pardon. I'm sure there was a question to Debbie. Lindsay, can you come to OMUs and prisons? Well, I don't know about that. I'm a very busy woman, but I'm sure Debbie and I could potentially come and do a double act in your prison if you really wanted us to. Bless your
I'm
heart.
happy to come. I'm always happy to come into prisons.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was Tim who I see Tim's name. I think he had a question for Debbie, and I'm
Yeah.
trying to find it.
I think the question was about, and I
Mhm.
absolutely accept it. Absolutely accept it. You know, I was a prison officer for many years when there was more of us on the landings, and it was still a struggle then. So I think Tim's point was a really good point, that you know, when we have so few staff, that we struggle really to unlock people, to give them their basic requirements. How do we form relationships? Well, yeah, I get it, of course I get it, but what I will also say is, you know, even if you're unlocking somebody once a day and then escorting them down for a meal, or, you know, supervising them on exercise, there is time and ways that you can form those relationships, and that's being, you know, all the stuff we've talked about is how you know, you can be approachable, how you can be kind, how you can ask people how they are, how you can follow through on requests, and how you can have that integrity. It's all of that stuff that we know makes good prison officers, will make forming those relationships, well, it will be a start to forming those relationships. Of course, I accept that sometimes you can't sit down for an hour with somebody and talk to them, but it's that you know, we used to say to it, didn't we, every contact matters. Every contact does matter. And you know, people, how you respond to people will give them an indication about how far they can start thinking about trusting you. So I think it's just about all those contacts. But I do absolutely accept the time thing. And, you know, other people have put in the chat that, you know, this is important work, but people aren't given the resources to do it. Yep. And I really wish I could wave a magic wand and change that.
Thank you, Debbie. That's brilliant. Leanne, sorry, I do remember you asked this at the very start of the session. Can you please just recap what the new tool and the intranet equip will cover and include, please? Also, do we have a date that will be that this will go live? On the date this will go live, that's still very much under discussion at the moment. Debbie and I are working with the intranet team to create a document that is fully accessible and conforms to the various kind of written standards of plain English styles. But yeah, the document is called Care Experience Matters, and it is a document. I say it's a document. What we should probably call it is a handbook. It's quite a weighty tome. It's about 83 pages, and please don't worry, we are not expecting you to read this cover to cover. It's something that that we would like you to dip in and dip out of as and when you need it. So the actual just to explain, the document in every single section, it breaks down what care experience people have told us, what probation can do, what prisons can do, and what local authorities can do. There's like sets of manageable actions under each heading, and the headings are identification, personal advisor support, maintaining contact, sentence planning, resettlement planning, and pathway planning. Financial support, clothing, footwear and possessions, release and resettlement back into the community. And then we have a section on additional considerations, especially those around care experienced women, foreign national offenders, those over the age of 25, those in contact with youth custody services, and additional considerations for diversity and inclusion. So we're hoping, Debbie and I are really hoping, it's going to go live in a few weeks. And you will know about it because it's going to go on. I think, Debbie, is the plan to have a press release on the main HMPPS intranet page. But I can say that it is going around every single newsletter within HMPPS that we can possibly think of as well.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think just looking at the time, I'm conscious that we're almost till 4:30 and we want to finish on time. So thank you. It remains for me to say thank you actually to everybody that's been involved today, and that's from you know, our panelists and presenters, so Lindsay, Steve and Charlie, but also to the attendees who have really interacted brilliantly with this. And also, of course, to the Insights team for agreeing to host the event. I think just, you know, a couple of final observations really from me is that, you know, it always strikes me every time we do something like this and bring a different element in, is the amount of conversation that this generates and the amount of interest that it generates, because you know, it's a group of people that we do need to understand better, and that was reflected in some of the questions. And I think, you know, some of the things that I've taken from today is the stuff that we need to remind ourselves that's important, you know, and it's important that we put the person at the centre of all of this. It's important that we understand and recognise that not everybody thinks or learns or remembers in the same way. And, you know, that's not just about people with care experience necessarily. You know, it's about us recognising that people are different. And I think it's also the importance of us exploring and understanding really how we can do this better and use what we've learnt today in thinking about how we drive our practices and policies forward, but looking through the lens of care experience. And you know, and I when I was the Dep at Brinsford, I did used to think this, and it resonated with me. And actually, something Charlie said is you know, the stuff that helps with that cognition and that learning. And one of the things, you know, great diet and exercise. So what is it we do in prisons? We give people their breakfast the night before and then expect them still have their breakfast the next morning. They won't have done often, they'll eat it the night before, and then we expect them to go off and do a full day of learning and wonder why it doesn't happen. And, you know, it's just things like this that you know, might seem relatively simple things that we can think about that might make all the difference. So and you know, and the role of the virtual heads, you know, that's something for a long time I think, well, you know, why can't prison education be involved in virtual schools? So lots of stuff I think for the future and for us to think about. So I think it just remains to say again, thank you to everybody. An email will be sent out after the presentation that will ask you for some feedback, if that's okay, and I'd be really grateful if you can do that. And it also sends you the link into the presentations and also the recordings. And I think that's all I need to say, other than just wish you all a really lovely rest of the day and a good weekend when it comes. Thank you very much.